No one knew where the dog had come from. He wasn't a pet, not a neighbor's dog, just a stray. But there he was, sitting beside the little girl's coffin, his sad eyes staring at her lifeless body. He never barked. He never moved. At first, people thought it was just a coincidence. But when they tried to move him, he did something that sent chills down everyone's spine. This is not just a story about a stray dog. This is a story about loyalty beyond death, about an unbreakable bond between a little girl and the one friend who never left her side, even in her final moments. But what truly happened that day? And why was this dog so attached to her? What people discovered later left them speechless. Stay till the end, because this story is something you'll never forget. In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling green hills and winding roads, there was a little girl named Lily. If you ever visited this town, you wouldn't have to ask who she was. Everyone knew her, not because she was the mayor's daughter or came from a famous family, but because of something far more special. Lily had a heart that shone brighter than the sun. She was the kind of child who would stop in the middle of the street to help an elderly woman pick up her dropped groceries, the kind who would build tiny shelters for stray cats in the winter, tucking little blankets inside so they wouldn't be cold. She had this way of making everyone feel important, humans, animals, even the smallest creatures that others overlooked. But out of everything she did, there was one act of kindness that would change everything. In the streets of this small town, forgotten by the world, roamed a nameless stray dog, a thin, scrappy-looking golden-furred mutt who had no home, no collar, and no place to belong. His ribs jutted out beneath his fur, a clear sign that he hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. His eyes were dull, tired, like someone who had seen too much cruelty. Most people ignored him. Some threw rocks at him. Others chased him away with sticks. To them, he was just a nuisance, another stray dog they didn't want hanging around their perfect little neighborhood. But to Lily, he was special. She first saw him sitting by the school gate one afternoon. It was the start of winter, and a cold wind had begun to creep through the streets. While other kids laughed and ran past, excited to get home, Lily stopped. She noticed how the dog shivered, his thin fur barely offering any warmth. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt down and offered him half of her sandwich. At first, the dog didn't move. He just stared at her with those wary eyes, as if trying to decide if this was another trick. Then, hesitantly, carefully, he stepped forward and took the sandwich from her hand. That was the beginning. From that day on, Lily made it her mission to take care of him. Every afternoon, she brought him food, sometimes leftovers from dinner, other times the best part of her school lunch. She'd sit beside him, talking to him as if he could understand every word, and maybe in some way he did. She named him Max. "Now you have a name," she whispered to him one day, scratching behind his ear. "That means you belong somewhere." For the first time in what felt like forever, Max wagged his tail. It didn't matter that he was just a stray, unwanted by the world. To Lily, he was family. But then the unthinkable happened. It was a Friday evening. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lily had just finished her piano lesson and was on her way home, humming a song to herself. She was thinking about Max, about how she'd saved a piece of chicken from dinner just for him. She couldn't wait to see him. As she reached the last stretch of road before her house, she looked both ways. It was a quiet street. Hardly any cars passed by at this time. But then a sound, a low, distant hum of an engine. She turned her head. A car. It was coming too fast. Much too fast. Lily took a step forward. She wasn't worried. She had crossed this road 100 times before. But the driver? He never saw her. The car came speeding around the corner, tires screeching against the pavement. For a single, frozen second, everything seemed to slow down. Lily's eyes widened. The driver's hands yanked the wheel, but it was too late. And then, a sickening thud. The world went silent. The car skidded to a stop several feet away. The driver stumbled out, face pale, hands trembling. People screamed. Someone dropped their groceries. Doors swung open. Neighbors rushed out. And there, in the middle of the road, lay Lily. Her tiny body, so full of life just moments ago, now motionless. The driver, a young man no older than 25, stood frozen in horror. His lips parted, but no words came out. His hands clutched his head as if trying to wake himself from this nightmare. And then, before anyone else could move, a golden blur rushed into the street. Max, he had been nearby, waiting for Lily like he always did. The moment he saw her, something inside him shattered. He sprinted forward, his paws barely touching the ground. His tail, which had once wagged so joyfully, was now low. His ears were flattened against his skull. He stopped right beside her, sniffed her face, nudged her hand. She didn't move. A soft whimper escaped his throat. He tried again, nosing at her fingers, her cheek, her shoulder, anything to get her to respond, but she never did. And then, he lay down beside her, right there, in the middle of the road. People shouted for him to move. Someone tried to step closer, but Max growled, a deep, desperate sound, as if warning the world, "Don't take her away from me." For the first time in his life, he had found someone who saw him, not as a stray, not as a problem, but as family. And now she was gone. The ambulance came. Sirens wailed. Paramedics rushed in. A stretcher was brought out. But when they lifted Lily's small, lifeless body, Max let out a sound that no one in that town would ever forget. A long, heartbreaking howl. A sound filled with sorrow, with loss, with something more human than any words could ever express. They took her away. The driver was taken into custody. Neighbors whispered. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. But Max, he didn't move. He sat there, in the middle of that road, long after the crowd had left. And when night fell, when the streetlights flickered on and the world turned quiet, he stood up and walked. Not to any home, not to any shelter, but to the funeral home. Somehow he knew. Somehow he found her. And when the day of Lily's funeral arrived, when her tiny coffin was placed in the center of the church, surrounded by flowers, candles, and the tear-streaked faces of those who loved her, Max was there. He walked in, silent as a shadow. No one stopped him. No one dared. He sat beside her coffin, and he never left. Not when the priest spoke, not when her parents wept, not when the final prayers were said, and the last goodbyes were whispered into the air. Max stayed, because he wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just a forgotten dog. He was hers, and he always would be. What happened next shocked everyone. The town fell into a silence that felt heavier than words. Losing a child is something no one prepares for. No one wants to stand in a church, staring at a tiny white coffin, trying to accept the unbearable truth. Parents held their children tighter. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply sat, frozen in their grief. It felt wrong. Lily was supposed to be outside, running through the streets with her wild curls bouncing in the wind. She was supposed to be at the bakery, pressing her face against the glass display to pick out her favorite treat. She was supposed to be alive, but she wasn't. And as her coffin was gently placed at the front of the church, surrounded by candles and soft floral arrangements, the weight of her absence pressed down on everyone. Then he arrived. At first, no one noticed. The doors of the church had been left slightly open, letting in a faint breeze. But with that breeze came something else. A shadow, a quiet, steady presence. A few people gasped as they realized what, or rather, who, had entered. Max, the stray, the dog who had once been nothing more than a nameless figure in the background of their town. The dog most of them had ignored, chased away, or simply never noticed. Now he stood there, at the entrance of the church. His golden fur was still unkempt. His paws were dusty from walking the streets. But his eyes, those eyes, held something no one could ignore. A grief so deep, so raw, it felt almost human. No one had brought him. No one had led him here. Yet somehow, he had found his way. And he wasn't just sitting at the back. He walked forward, with slow, deliberate steps. Max padded down the aisle, past rows of people in dark clothing, past strangers who had never given him a second glance. Straight to Lily, without hesitation, without confusion. He sat down right beside her coffin, and he didn't move. At first, people exchanged glances. Some assumed he would get bored and leave. After all, he was just a dog. But Max didn't move. He didn't lie down, didn't fidget, didn't sniff around like dogs normally do. He just sat, perfectly still, staring at the wooden coffin that held the only person who had ever truly seen him. Minutes passed, then an hour. A few people tried to shoo him away. Go on, boy, go home. But he wouldn't. An old man in the back whispered, maybe someone should take him outside. But no one moved, because deep down they knew. This wasn't just a lost dog wandering in by accident. This was something else. As time stretched on, the priest finally stepped forward. He cleared his throat, unfolding a small piece of paper. His voice was soft, yet it trembled with the weight of the moment. We are gathered here today, he began, to honor the life of a child who... Then it happened. The moment the priest spoke, Max, who had been silent all this time, lifted his head, and then he howled. Not just a simple whimper, not a quick bark, but a long, slow, heart-wrenching howl. It wasn't the kind of sound you heard from a dog begging for food or howling at the moon. No, this was different. It was raw, full of pain, full of something deeper than anyone could explain. A sound so haunting, so filled with sorrow, it sent chills down every spine in that room. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A child buried her face into her mother's coat. Even the priest paused. It was as if Max wasn't just mourning. He was crying. Tears welled up in the eyes of the mourners. Even those who weren't dog lovers, who had never given Max a second thought, felt it. An elderly woman in the front row pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's not just a dog mourning," she whispered. "He knows." And at that moment, it became undeniable. Max wasn't just sitting beside a coffin. He wasn't just there because of instinct or habit. He had come to say goodbye. When the funeral ended, people expected Max to leave. They assumed someone would take him away, or that he'd wander off like stray dogs always do. But he didn't. He stayed. Even after the candles were blown out, even after the chairs were stacked and the guests began to leave, he refused to move from his spot beside Lily's coffin. A few townspeople tried to call him. One woman, who had never paid much attention to the dog before, bent down and whispered, "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you some food." Max ignored her. Someone else tried to lure him outside with treats. He didn't even look at them. The funeral director, an older man who had seen grief in many forms, sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Let him be," he finally said. And so they did. The next morning, the town awoke to a strange sight. At the cemetery, where Lily had been laid to rest, a few mourners had gathered to leave flowers. But before they even stepped through the gates, they saw him, Max, lying on top of her grave. Not near it, not beside it, directly on top, curled up, motionless, as if he were guarding her, as if, even in death, he refused to leave her side. A heavy silence fell over the people watching. For the first time in years, no one saw Max as just a stray. He wasn't an unwanted street dog anymore. He was Lily's dog, and even though she was gone, he wasn't letting go. For years, people had ignored Max. They had shooed him away. But now, as they stood before him, watching as he refused to leave the only person who had ever loved him, something inside them changed. A woman set down a bowl of food. A man brought an old, worn blanket and gently placed it beside the grave. People who had once treated Max like nothing now saw him for what he truly was. A dog who had loved, a dog who had lost, a dog who would never ever forget. But what happened next, no one saw coming. The ceremony was over. People wiped away their last tears, pulling their coats tighter around themselves as they stood up. The whispers in the church had faded into quiet footsteps. The funeral had ended, but the grief, that would never end. Lily's coffin was gently lifted, carried outside to the hearse that would take her to her final resting place. The air was heavy with sorrow. The sound of muffled crying filled the space as the procession began. Families huddled together. Friends placed gentle hands on each other's shoulders. No one spoke much, because what could they say? What words could possibly bring comfort in a moment like this? But as they stepped outside, they weren't the only ones following. Max, the golden-furred stray, who had sat by Lily's coffin throughout the entire funeral, stood up. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and without hesitation, he followed. Not because someone called him, not because he was being led on a leash, but because he knew this wasn't over. People noticed, exchanging quiet glances. Some thought he might get distracted, wander off like strays usually do. But he didn't. With slow, steady steps, Max walked beside the grieving crowd, his eyes fixed on the wooden box that held the only human who had ever loved him, as if he understood, as if he was saying his own goodbye. The cemetery was a short drive away. Cars lined the narrow road as people arrived one by one. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the clouds in streaks of orange and pink. A gentle wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth. But before the first person even stepped through the cemetery gates, Max was already there. Somehow, he had beaten them to it. No one knew how. He had been walking with them, slow, steady, never rushing. Yet, as the first family members arrived, Max was already waiting, sitting right by the freshly dug grave. His golden fur was ruffled by the wind. His ears perked as he watched the approaching crowd. It was as if he had known exactly where they were going, as if he had been here before. People murmured in disbelief. Some wiped away fresh tears, their hearts aching at the sight of the stray dog who refused to leave. A little boy tugged at his father's coat. "Daddy, why is the dog here?" he asked in a small voice. The man swallowed, glancing down at Max before answering softly, "Because he loved her." The priest stood near the grave, waiting for everyone to gather. The pallbearers lowered Lily's coffin into the ground. A painful silence stretched across the crowd, and then, Max moved. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and then he lay down, right on top of the fresh soil, as if he belonged there, as if this grave was his home now. People expected Max to leave after a while. Surely, he would get tired. Surely, when the last of the mourners walked away, he would wander off too. But he didn't. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the cemetery. The air grew colder. The crowd grew smaller. One by one, people left. But Max stayed. A woman placed a flower beside the grave. She bent down, whispering, "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you somewhere warm." Max didn't move. A man tried to lure him away with food. "Come, boy," he called gently, holding out a piece of meat. Max didn't even look up. His body remained pressed against the grave, his golden fur blending with the earth. His eyes never left the wooden marker that bore Lily's name. Minutes turned to hours. The cemetery emptied. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of car doors closing, engines starting, and families returning to homes filled with grief. And yet, under the darkening sky, Max remained, alone, silent, waiting. By the next morning, Max was still there. Word spread quickly. Villagers whispered among themselves. The shopkeeper, who had once chased Max away from his store, shook his head in disbelief. The old woman who had once ignored the stray wiped away a tear as she peered through her window. Children asked their parents, "Why won't he leave?" No one had an answer. A few kind-hearted souls brought him food. They placed it near the grave, waiting for him to eat. But he didn't. Not a single bite. They tried moving him, gently nudging him, coaxing him with soft words. He wouldn't budge. It was as if his body was rooted to that spot, as if leaving meant losing her all over again. Day after day, he remained. Through the rain, through the cold, villagers left blankets, hoping to keep him warm. Some visited just to check on him. But Max wanted nothing except to stay right where he was, by her. A week passed. Max never left. By now, the entire town knew his story. The story of a stray no one wanted, a dog most had ignored. The story of Lily's only true friend. People began to see him differently, not as just a stray, but as something more, a soul who had loved and lost, just like them. And then one morning, he was gone. At first, people thought he had finally given up, that maybe, after all these days, he had decided to move on. But then, they found him, curled up, still, right beside Lily's grave, his body no longer rising and falling with breath, his golden fur dusted with the morning dew, his eyes closed, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Only this time, he wouldn't wake up. The townspeople gathered once more, not for Lily, for Max. The dog they had once ignored was now one of their own. Some said he died of heartbreak. Others said he simply couldn't bear to be apart from Lily any longer. But one thing was certain, Max wasn't just a stray anymore. He was family. And so, the town did something it had never done before. They buried him, right beside Lily, not in an unmarked grave, not forgotten, but beside the one person who had loved him most. A small wooden marker was placed above his grave, just like Lily's. It had only 3 words, loyal, until death. And in the years that followed, whenever people passed by that small, quiet cemetery, they would always stop, not just for Lily, but for the dog who never left her side. Not in life, not in death, never. No one could say exactly how it happened, how an unwanted stray dog and an 8-year-old girl found each other, how 2 souls, one human, one animal, formed a bond so powerful that even death couldn't break it. But it happened, and the town would never forget. Some people tried to explain it. Maybe Lily had a kindness about her that Max had sensed before anyone else. Maybe, in a world where most people saw him as just another stray, she saw something more. Maybe he wasn't just a dog to her. Maybe he was family. And when you love someone like family, you never leave them behind, not even in death. The town had seen devotion before. They had seen mothers mourning their children, fathers sitting in silent grief, siblings holding onto memories that time would never erase. But Max, he was different. He wasn't human, and yet he had loved Lily in a way that felt more human than anything they had ever seen. People had questions. They always do when something unexplainable happens. How had Max found his way to the church that day? No one had brought him. No one had led him inside. Yet there he was, sitting by her coffin, unmoving, unblinking, as if he had always known he was meant to be there. How had he known where they were taking her afterward? No one had shown him the way. Yet when the mourners arrived at the cemetery, he was already there, waiting, as if he had always known where she would be. How had he survived a week without food, without shelter, through cold nights and rainy days? People tried to take care of him. They left him food, soft blankets, kind words, but he wanted none of it. It was as if nothing in the world mattered to him anymore, except staying close to Lily. And then, when his body could take no more, he lay down beside her grave and never got up again. There's a belief, whispered in quiet places, that some souls are connected, that no matter where they are, no matter what happens, they always find their way back to each other. Maybe Max and Lily were like that. Maybe they had been meant to meet, meant to love each other in a world that so often turns away from things it doesn't understand, meant to stay together, even when everything else tried to tear them apart. Because love, real love, doesn't end when life does. It lingers, in memories, in echoes of laughter that never truly fade, in the places where two souls once stood together. And sometimes, it stays so strong that not even death can take it away. Years passed, people moved on, families grew, children were born, seasons changed. But one thing never changed. Lily and Max. Their graves remained side by side, just as they had been in life. People who had once ignored Max, the shopkeeper, the schoolteacher, the old man who used to shoo him away, now stopped by his grave. Some left flowers, some simply stood there, saying nothing, and some knelt down, whispering words only the wind would carry. Not prayers, not apologies, just quiet words of understanding, because they knew Max had never been just a stray. He had been loved, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The world forgets things too quickly. Stories fade, names disappear, but some stories refuse to be lost. Children in the town grew up hearing the tale of the dog who never left. Parents would point to the quiet graves under the old oak tree and say, "There lies Lily, the girl with the kindest heart," and right beside her, they would see another resting place. "There lies Max, the dog who never left her side," and the children would listen, eyes wide, hearts soft, because even in a world that often forgets, some love stories are too powerful to disappear. Max and Lily's was one of them. No one knows how Max found Lily, or why, but maybe that's the point. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. Maybe some things just are. Maybe Max wasn't just a stray. Maybe Lily wasn't just another child. Maybe, from the moment they met, they had always belonged to each other. And maybe, in the end, Max did the only thing he knew how to do: stay. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible animal stories.